Hello. Okay, I'm going to do my best tonight to talk to you a little bit about my most recent project that was published at the end of last year as a book with Hoxton Mini Press. But firstly, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my background and I guess show you a bit of work and what I do. Oh, here are the slides. So, okay. I've put some of my work up to give you a bit of context, but basically I kind of cover a range of subject matters, but there's sort of some consistent themes throughout my work. I think most of my personal work comes from some form of sort of self-exploration, and I tend to work with a lot of people, and I capture aspects of them that I personally can relate to. It's sort of I guess it's often some sort of self-reflection. I always shoot with available light or natural light, and I kind of find this process quite liberating and quite an organic way to work. Ultimately, I think I've always seeking some sort of emotion and honesty in my work. And I'm drawn to moments of sort of vulnerability and looking at relationships, be it the kind of relationships we have within ourselves or the relationships I have with my subjects or the relationships in the photographs, if that makes sense. So I think I found over the years my kind of images have become slightly less snapshot. They started out at the beginning as quite kind of snapshot aesthetic and slightly more considered. And I always seem to be sort of battling with the balance between documentation and something slightly more staged. So in the work here, obviously, it's a lot more formal than some of the previous work. But that kind of brings me on to Sisters, which is what I'm here to talk to you about, which I think sits somewhere between the middle of those two things. So I'm going to start just kind of rolling through some of the images just so you can get an idea of the project I'm talking about. This kind of came about because I began reflecting on my own relationship with my sister, and we've always had quite a difficult relationship, which has sort of left us at some distance. And I think in some weird way, I was trying to kind of speak to other sisters and almost find the answers for my own flawed relationship by kind of speaking to and kind of working with other sisters. I started off initially just putting out a casting call on social media, saying I wanted to work with some sisters and kind of, photograph them. And I decided to shoot the sisters within their own homes because I felt like, firstly, it would make the sisters much more comfortable, being in their own spaces, in their own kind of bedrooms or living rooms, but also it would often, in some cases, like this image, add a bit more context to, I guess, the story and the narrative. 2 years later, I'd ended up somehow shooting just about 80 sets of sisters. And I don't really know how it kind of ended up getting onto such a large scale. I kind of just kept going and almost wanting to, I guess, keep exploring this sort of relationship that I think is, kind of overlooked quite often. So I think the images sit somewhere between kind of family, more kind of formal family portraits and sort of, snapshots. I also, at the same time as photographing them, I decided to interview the sisters. But these were kind of quite informal conversations where the sisters would kind of talk and share stories, and they almost turned into kind of mini therapy sessions in some weird way, just reflecting on their relationship, basically. I'm going to now talk a little bit in depth about kind of the making of some of the images. I have got an image, this one, coming up. This is actually, I've kind of pulled this out because it's my favorite image from the series. And it kind of, I'm glad it made you laugh. And it's kind of, at the time when I took the photo, it really wasn't what I was going for or what I had in mind. And I was really disappointed when I left the shoot. And I kind of think sometimes when you have a preconceived idea of what you want, it's not necessarily always going to be the right thing or the best thing. And basically the shoots in general lasted anywhere between 10 minutes and kind of an hour, depending on how long I had with the sisters and how much time they had, and also how comfortable they were kind of in front of the camera. And in this case with Grace and Jessie, Grace, the 16-year-old girl, was at school and rushed back on her lunch break, and I think she was in the middle of kind of exams or revision, and her mum sat Jessie on her lap, and she just wouldn't stop crying, and then they'd pass her back to the mum and she'd be fine, and then it just kept going back and forth for about 5-10 minutes, and eventually I just had to shoot. And I think they were quite disappointed, and they were kind of like, oh, do you want to come back? And I was like, no, it's fine. Anyway, I walked away feeling quite deflated, and then in hindsight realised when looking through the edits and making selects that actually this is the best thing that could have happened. It's the most honest kind of representation of, I guess in some ways, sort of sisterhood, but also the situation. And I think perhaps some of the other images felt in some ways slightly more forced than I would have liked to. Then moving on, this is just so the book that we ended up producing, we only wanted to include one image per set of sisters. And obviously I had a bit of a tough time choosing some of the edits, and these sisters, Mimi and Coco, I was really drawn to the image on the right. Is it the right? It's on the left on my screen. On the right. No, on your left, sorry. Initially, and that was what I think I got emotionally attached to it after I took the photograph. And the publishers kept saying that they were looking for something a little bit more light-hearted, not so somber. And I think they were right. I'd kind of spent the whole series trying not to create cheesy family portraits, that some of the shots ended up feeling a little too kind of lacking in sort of light-heartedness. So in the end, they found this image, which is the one we ended up going for. And I don't know if you can tell, but I can see the girl behind is sort of slightly smirking, and it's got that, a bit more of a light-heartedness. There was one where they were bursting out laughing, but I refused that. So that's just to give you this next image. I've pulled it out to talk about because it was probably my most challenging image for me to take. And that's purely because I was so used to working one-on-one with people. And obviously with sisters, 2s was one thing, 3s another, and then I knew I had this shoot of 6 sisters coming up, and I was really nervous because I was like, how am I going to make this work? And I arrived at the house, and all the girls had just got back from holiday, and the house was really chaotic, suitcases everywhere. They all shared rooms, but it was a complete mess, and there was basically nowhere to shoot. And initially I had them all stood on the landing with a skylight over them, and honestly it looked like the worst band shot ever, just awful. And I just kept thinking, I was taking these shots and I was just thinking, what am I going to do? Because they're such great subjects, but I'm the worst photographer ever. So anyway, I thought we'd found everywhere in their home, and then I asked to see their parents' bedroom, and they opened the door, and it was like this absolute haven, big double bed, light coming through the window, and I kind of got them all to jump on the bed, and that's where this shot and kind of some others were taken. And I guess I quite like the fact that you've got the Madonna, that sort of symbolism, but also the fact that it's looking down on them, the fact that they're all on their parents' bed, I find quite symbolic. But also for me, it's an image that I think today I still feel was a challenge, but I kind of got over that challenge. I pushed myself. So that's why I've pulled that out. I'm going to quickly move on to just, a few more edits, or outtakes, I should say, of these girls, Unity and Zeta, which were really fun to work with. They were quite playful in front of the camera, and we did quite a few setups. But in the end, I went for this image, which I really liked the juxtaposition of them. Obviously, they're quite young, beautiful girls, but they're kind of sat in a very formal, almost like adult-like manner, and I quite like that kind of, they're almost sat identically. And I think at the time when I made the shot, they were kind of messing around, and I said, girls, sit up straight, and they kind of both kind of looked at me with this sort of stark expression. So I went for that shot in the book, and then we ended up using this shot as the cover image. I think the cover in general, covers of books in general are really difficult to get right, and I think I really didn't want to put one face to the project after working with so many sisters, but I felt this was probably the most graphic image, and obviously you can't see their faces, but also it's kind of a little bit cliche and a little bit light, but I think it was probably the right choice. So then the books arrived. You might not have seen them, but they came out, end of last November, and I think they've been doing pretty well, and Hoxton Mini Press were really great to work with. And lastly, I'm just going to end on, because I kind of briefly touched on the fact that I interviewed extensively all these sisters that I shot. I ended up working with a really great writer called Emma Finmore, and together we pulled out sort of quotes from each set of sisters, or a little dialogue that sat beside each image. And then at the back of the book, she ended up writing a kind of summary for each set of sisters. So again, it just adds that bit more of a context. I think at the moment, the project's become this publication, and I think somewhere down the line, if I were to exhibit it, I'd really want to use the sound bites from the recorded interviews, because I think the voices in general just will add so much. But yeah, that's it. Thank you.